4 teenage boys confessed to rape and murder. Police said the case was solved. Then the DNA came back. Not one of the boys matched. Not one. The case should have ended right there. It didn't. Instead, prosecutors kept going. Those boys would be convicted anyway. And the man whose DNA was found was still out there. How does this happen? On November 7th, 1994, a woman named Nina Glover was found dead in the dumpster behind the family Supermart liquor store at 1400 West Garfield Boulevard in Chicago's Englewood neighborhood. She was 30 years old. She had been raped. She had been strangled. For detectives, the pressure was immediate. A woman had been murdered. A family needed answers. And somewhere in Chicago, the person responsible was still free. Police needed to find the killer. What happened next would send 4 teenagers to prison and leave the real answer hidden for years. Michael Saunders was 15 years old. Harold Richardson was 16. Vincent Thames was 17. Terrell Swift was 17. None of them looked like a kind of suspects most people imagine when they think about a murder case. But detectives weren't looking at their ages. They were looking at their statements. As investigators worked the case, they became convinced that they found the person responsible for Nina Glover's death. The more they looked, the more confident they became. By the time the investigation moved forward, detectives believed they knew exactly what happened and exactly who had done it. There was just one problem. The evidence that seemed strongest was about to become the most controversial part of the entire case. The confessions appeared powerful. Investigators believed they explained the crime. But the statements were not clean. They had inconsistencies, and no physical evidence tied the teenagers to the scene. For detectives, that mattered. Confessions are powerful. Juries trust them. Police trust them. Most people trust them. And investigators believe the confessions explain what happened to Nina Glover. The case seemed to be coming together. 4 teens, multiple confessions, a murder investigation that appeared solved. If the story ended there, few people would have questioned the outcome. But another piece of evidence was sitting in a laboratory. And it was about to tell a completely different story. DNA testing was performed on evidence recovered from the crime scene. Investigators expected answers. They got one. The profile did not match Michael Saunders. It did not match Harold Richardson. It did not match Vincent Thames. It did not match Terrell Swift. Not one. The DNA belongs to someone else. Think about what that meant. 4 teenagers had confessed. Detectives believed them. The case appeared solved. Yet one piece of evidence that could not be pressured, persuaded, or intimidated pointed somewhere else. The confession said one thing. The DNA said another. And both could not be true. At this point, the case should have been falling apart. The DNA did not exclude one suspect. It excluded all 4. Michael Saunders, Harold Richardson, Vincent Times, Terrell Swift. All excluded. Think about that for a second. The state's theory was the 4 teenagers committed the crime together. The DNA found one man, not 4. 1. In most investigations, that changes everything. A confession can be challenged. A witness can be mistaken. But DNA is different. DNA doesn't care what detectives believe. It doesn't care what prosecutors think happened. It either matches or it doesn't. And in this case, it didn't. The evidence was pointing away from the boys. The question now wasn't whether the confessions were true. The question was, what would happen next? What happened next is the reason people still talk about this case today. The DNA exclusion did not stop the prosecutions. The DNA exclusion did not stop the trials. And it did not stop the convictions. The case moved forward. Think about that. 4 teenagers had confessed. All 4 had been excluded by DNA. Yet the prosecution's theory remained the same. The boys were still charged. The boys were still tried. And eventually, the boys were still convicted. The DNA had changed the evidence. It had not changed the outcome. At that point, a new question emerged. If the science wasn't enough to stop the case, what would have been? Prosecutors had an explanation. The confessions still mattered. They argued, even if the DNA pointed somewhere else. At first glance, the explanation sounds possible, but it creates a new problem. If someone else's DNA was at the scene, then who was that person? And if that person had nothing to do with the crime, why was their DNA there? Remember what was at stake. Nina Glover had been raped. Nina Glover had been murdered. If the DNA belonged to someone else, then someone else was connected to whatever happened to her. The question wasn't going away. It was getting bigger. Years later, investigators finally got an answer. The DNA profile had a name. Johnny Douglas. And when that name surfaced, It changed the case because Johnny Douglas wasn't a random stranger. He wasn't someone investigators had ever heard of. Police had interviewed him early in the investigation, back in 1994. He was present when Nina Glover's body was discovered. Think about that. For years, the case had been built around 4 teenagers, 4 confessions, 4 convictions. Meanwhile, the DNA was pointing somewhere else. Now it had a name attached to it. Johnny Douglas. And that name belonged to someone police had already talked to. The question was no longer whether the man had existed. The question was how close investigators had been to him all along. And the answer was closer than many people realized. On May 13th, 2011, Illinois State Police reported a DNA match to Johnny Douglas. What changed was time. Years later, an unsealed FBI report raised a critical question. According to the public reporting on the report, investigators alleged police fed information to the teenagers during their statements. If true, it would offer one explanation for the mystery that had been defined by the case. How confessions could appear convincing while the DNA pointed somewhere else. The report did not erase the contradiction, but it offered a possible explanation for it. Eventually, the convictions began to unravel. The DNA evidence that once been explained away could no longer be ignored. The case against the 4 teenagers collapsed. Years after they had been sent to prison, they were finally released. For the first time in a long time, they were free. And that matters. Wrongful convictions should be corrected. Innocent people should not remain in prison. But freedom does not rewind time. It does not return missed birthdays. It doesn't return years spent behind bars. It doesn't give a teenager back the years that turned him into a grown man inside a prison cell. The legal fight was ending. The human cost was not. And that is the part of the story that is hardest to measure. Michael Saunders was 15 years old when he enters the system. By the time he was free, he was a grown man. The same was true for Harold Richardson, Vincent Thames, Terrell Swift. The convictions were overturned. The record was corrected. But some things can't be corrected. A teenager gets one childhood. A young man gets one chance to spend in his 20s. Time only moves in one direction. That is what makes cases like this different. The DNA eventually told the truth. The courts eventually listened. But the years in between did not disappear. They became part of 4 lives. And that may be the hardest part of this story. 4 teenagers entered interrogation rooms. The truth eventually freed them. It just took 15 years. And 15 years is a very long time to wait for the truth.